Hello. Today I am joined by Kitty Stryker. She is a published author, anarchist activist, and queer femme located in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's author of three books: Ask, Building Consent Culture, Ask Yourself, the Consent Culture Workbook, and Say More, Consent Conversations for Teens. I have read Ask Yourself, and I owe you a blurb. So this is my blurb. Read this book. It's incredible. You're also a former sex worker and a freelance writer with bylines in Teen Vogue, Vice, Rolling Stone, and other fine publications. We are both Vice alums, so that's
Yep.
fun. Um,
Survivors from the trenches.
exactly. So thank you so much. I reached out to you because there's a consent slash rape, I don't know, scandal isn't the word, but revelations, I guess, kind of roiling
Situation.
situation roiling my community in the Bay Area. I'm no longer living in the Bay Area, but these are still, my friends that are affected. And I've been writing a lot about how cultures that are more strong in sex positive feminism tend to have less rape and sexual assault than cultures that are more sexually repressive and more gender inegalitarian, which is true. But that might lead some to conclude that sex positive feminism is some kind of silver bullet for preventing rape. And what this
If only.
situation, right, revealed in very stark terms is like this person was a leader in sex positive feminist spaces, spaces where parties that he organized would begin with consent talks. He knew consent and used what he knew to predate on young women.
Mhm.
So it is simply saying the right things and educating people is not enough, unfortunately, is what we're having to learn the hard way. And so I was like, you know what? Maybe there is a silver bullet. Maybe there's something that we can all be doing that would actually solve this problem. And so I reached out to not a consent expert because that's not a thing, but someone who thought a lot about consent and had to think about consent and written about consent. And we had a conversation, and you're like, no, there isn't a silver bullet. And so that's the first thing I want to get across. If you don't have
Yeah.
time to watch this whole thing, I need you to understand that it is not there is no simple solution. It's not, oh, we can all just do this and it will be fine. We can't just kill all rapists. We can't just educate people. There's nothing
Yeah.
that by itself is going to work. And so that's the first thing you need to understand. But yeah, we're going to talk about it. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I love talking about this at length. But when it's planned, not when I'm at a party. Please, please don't approach me and talk to me endlessly about rape when I'm at a party. I do sometimes try to just go out and have a nice time.
Please don't do that to anyone.
Yeah, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, consent is important across the board, when it comes to disclosing things, get consent. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I mean, I think that is a good entry point to a lot of the work that I do, right? Because, like, so when I started working with consent culture and sort of publicizing the term, there were a couple of other people who were also beginning to write about it. We were sort of defining it. I've since learned that, like, other academics have talked about a culture of consent here and there. So, like, I don't think it didn't exist before 2010, but I do think there wasn't a lot of conversations between people, especially outside of academia, that was saying, what does this mean? Like, if we were to say, let's enact a consent culture, what does that look like? What does that actually mean? What are the actions that take place? There was a lot of, like, sort of academic woo woo, idealism, which is great and important. But I was dealing with situations in the San Francisco kink community that were like, okay, but people are having their boundaries crossed pretty much constantly. And young submissive women are being taught that having your boundaries crossed is part of the process, that that's just normal. And I found that deeply alarming because I came from, second wave feminism. My mom is a second wave feminist. So I knew that maybe that was normal, but it didn't have to be. Like it wasn't inevitable. Um, and the more I started to talk about it with other people, the more I started to say, well, hang on, like this is really widespread. And isn't it interesting that a culture that talks so much about how important consent is, safe, sane, and consensual, risk aware, consensual kink, like all of these things, consent is like super, like that's the thing that separates
Consensual
a kinky
non-monogamy.
person. Yeah, this is the thing that separates these behaviors from criminal behaviors, right? Like if you're hitting somebody for consensual pleasure, that's fine, right? Like that's the big difference. And
Right.
yet, somehow in these communities, abuse was rampant and dismissed. Um, and I began to say, well, so why is that? And I began to notice, oh, it's because a lot of the people who are doing the majority of the abuse are the community leaders. And they're the ones who run the parties. They're the ones who own the spaces. So it's not so easy to kick them out. Who's going to take their
Right.
place?
Who's going to take their place, and what are you going to lose by making a stink about it?
Absolutely.
And I think it's really interesting you say that about, because I've definitely seen that. I mean, you see it and there's a lot of, conversation is going to be really hard because there's like a million things to say and a million like
Oh,
orders to say
absolutely.
them
Yeah.
in. It all relates to each other. So that's just hard. But there's like in kink communities, and it's the same with consensual non-monogamy. Non-consensual non-monogamy is cheating. Non-consensual
Right.
hitting is assault.
Right.
Yeah, the consent is definitional. It's, and sex is consensual. Non-consensual sex is rape, right? But this assumes that there's like a hard line between consent and non-consent, which is part of what we're going to talk about,
Absolutely.
of course. But in the kink world, there's, and I think this is okay. And again, this is what is difficult about it, where you pushed your boundaries. And some people like that. Some people like to have their boundaries
Hmm.
pushed and tested. But then there's pushed your boundaries in a way that's abusive. And it's really hard to tell from the outside or even the inside sometimes, which is
Yeah. And
which.
I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell in the moment. And, I mean, just to probably jump way ahead, if you can't necessarily tell in the moment, and then later you say, oh, actually, I don't think I was consenting to that. Oh, I do think I was coerced. Is that the fault of your top when even you couldn't tell at the time? Like who's to blame? And I hate saying blame because it's not really about blame, but I think that part of my problem with the whole, oh, there's a victim and an abuser in all these situations is that oftentimes everybody is functioning with the best information they have available. And then the
Absolutely.
actually abusive people get to skate under that radar. They get to skate under that aggressive good faith that everyone else has and manipulate that. I can't tell
Yeah.
you the number of Bay Area sex parties that started with an hour long consent conversation slash workshop that was mandatory and ended up being run by somebody who ended up in an accountability process. Like I, it's mind boggling. So if that isn't an indication of someone to trust, what is?
Right.
Ugh.
And that's one thing that I want to get across very clearly at the outset, again, for people who are pressed for time. The fact that someone is in a position of leadership does not make them trustworthy. The only thing that says is that person has been willing to step up and do the work and put in the time and usually money to lead. That doesn't make them trustworthy. It doesn't make them good. It doesn't make them talented. It doesn't make them anything but possessed of the privilege to get to a place where they can lead. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It makes them available.
yeah, it makes them available. And leadership is difficult and it's a wonderful thing to lead. But do not trust somebody just because they are a consent trainer. That
Yeah.
nothing they say about consent is necessary, unfortunately, is necessarily indicative of them actually believing those things, unfortunately. So the other thing I would say is, again, if people are pressed for time, consent is a matter of power. And the thing that my mom said to me when I was very young is never get into a relationship you can't leave. And
Hmm.
so if you are considering any kind of a relationship with anyone with any power, either you maintain enough power that you can get out of it without ruining your life, or you better be damn sure that they are not ever the kind of person that would take advantage of that power differential.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of those things that you know, is perhaps workable. I mean, I've lived with people before where we kind of had to stay together because we couldn't afford rent on our own, and like I think that there is, unfortunately, we live in a culture that makes it very difficult to have that kind of autonomy. Also, we live in a culture where we'll say that, but then when it comes to something like the workplace, we're expected to tolerate a lot of, shitty behavior. Um, and there's not that same acknowledgement. Like, there's that, oh, well, if you don't like your job, you could just leave and get another job. No, you can't. Like a lot of people can't do that. If I don't like the relationship I have with my landlord, I might not be able to find a better landlord. I might not have that autonomy. And so, since we have all these like little subtle power imbalances modeled for us in all of these areas of our lives, it becomes a little easier to excuse them in our romantic and sexual relationships or our family relationships. Because we're like, well, I mean, what does my free will mean anyway? Like it's ignored everywhere else. I think it does
Yeah.
normalize that in a way that is really pervasive.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I feel like obviously sex is special in certain ways, but it's also just another power relationship in other ways.
Hmm.
And in a way, we have this idea that a, taking advantage of a power differential in a sexual realm is both like run of the mill, like of course, because I get taken advantage of in power differentials in every other area of my life. But then we also have this idea that it's the worst thing that could possibly happen. It's one thing to be
Hmm.
taken advantage of at work, but somebody takes advantage of me and my genitals are involved. It's just necessarily the most, and it's like, well, I, it's again, this is difficult because I don't want to downplay the importance of like, yes, it is a special violation. And also it's it's also just kind of another violation. And I think like where you focus, and I think this is wonderful, is I think broadly rape and sexual assault kind of exists on a spectrum of like not intentional to very intentional. And
Hmm.
most sexual assaults exist somewhere on that spectrum. And for the less intentional end of the spectrum, education and accountability are super important tools and very effective.
Yeah.
For the more intentional end of the spectrum, you really need to be more aggressive in how you deal with those people because education just makes them better at raping. Um,
Hmm.
and I think that something that you're really big on, and I think this is really good, is that you can unintentionally take advantage of a power differential, um, in any aspect of your life, and it doesn't make you a monster, right?
Yeah,
If you ask somebody to work overtime, and let's say one employee comes for money and is doing this job just for fun, and the other employee is on the edge of being evicted from their apartment, well, when you ask the one who has a lot of power to do overtime, they're going to say yes or no from a place of power. If you ask the
right,
one who's about to be evicted, that's not as consensual a yes, right?
right,
And you don't know always how much power the other person has in an exchange.
right. I mean,
Just like
it can be dangerous to be honest about it if you are in the position of less power. Um, and so, yeah, we don't reward people for being vulnerable in those ways. In fact, I feel like we kind of punish them for it. So there's this sense of pride isn't really the right word, but this sort of guardedness that you are expected to develop to protect yourself from being taken advantage of. This is why in some of my writing I like to talk about entitlement culture instead of rape culture, because for me, I see rape as an aspect of that entitlement. And in that way, I feel like entitlement culture covers a lot of ground. I do think there's value in talking about rape as a specific violation. But in general, at least from the studies I've read, and I'm constantly reading more about this all the time, it does seem like oftentimes both intentional and unintentional, it's coming from a place of, I deserve this. I want this, so I should have it. Um, and whether that's somebody who wants to hear yes, and so they interpret any action as a yes, um, meaning well, or if they're out to cause harm. I think that both of those things come from a place of entitlement.
that is such an interesting lens. And I think you're definitely hitting on something that's super, super important and foundational. And it's interesting because not to be it's all capitalism, and I'm a fan of capitalism, but if you don't take advantage of power differentials as an employer, for example, you're going to be outcompeted in the marketplace,
Yeah.
right? And
Or even as
so
an
we
employee, we are
absolutely,
actively encouraged to trample on each other to survive and to get ahead. That is seen as being competitive, right? And so I feel like there's a lot of, I don't think, and I mean, we both know Ovens. Ovens and I debate this all the time over at Feminists for Liberty, etc. But I think that it's not inherently entitled. Like, I don't think capitalism necessarily has to require that. At least, I think maybe there's a way to do it that doesn't require that particular manipulation, but that's not how it's manifested. And this is kind of like my argument anti-communism too. Like, yeah, sure, in an ideal world, it sounds cool on paper, but the way that it is practiced is often super authoritarian and very anti queer, very anti freedom of religion. Like, I I can't be for that. And so it's like there's a huge difference between sort of the idealized version of like, well, if we could make this a utopia, and then how it actually manifests. And I think this is speaks a lot to some of my issues with solutions for what to do when you have a serial rapist in your midst. There's a lot of things that sound really great on paper if everybody's bought into it, but in practice, it's just not really manifesting that way.
yeah. And I definitely want to talk about that. I think, yeah, it's an interesting question of like how how do you have exchange that's more fully consensual, um, yeah, because like you said, if you bring up that you are, less empowered, that makes it easier for somebody who wants to take advantage of you to take advantage of you. Um, in a sense, any exchange is kind of any exchange where there's any power differential is somewhat exploitative if both people are going for their own best interest,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
So that's a
potentially.
hard,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it's hard to say, right? And I
hard to
mean, and
say.
again, like, yeah, and I spent a lot of time reading philosophy also, which is all across the board on like how to handle these things, right? Like, or even I think it comes down to core things like, are people inherently good or inherently evil? And like, what influences their behavior? Is this something that is just part of human nature, or is it something that is nurtured in us? Are there cultures where this isn't as much of a priority? Um, I think it's really difficult to study these things without having a bias tainting everything that you read and everything you take in. You know, there's a lot of confirmation bias of like we take in the information that supports what we believe and we just sort of ignore the rest. I think that's absolutely part of this conversation. Um, yeah, I mean, it's so ingrained in how humans interact with each other, and it's seen as so inevitable in how humans interact with each other that it's really hard to think of a solution that isn't just torch it all to the ground and start over. And that's not really practical because, like, yeah, again, yeah, that sounds very fun and like, oh, okay, that sounds cool on paper. But what that actually means in practice is usually a lot of people get murdered. And I'm not really
Right.
comfortable with that solution.
I call that a drawback.
Yeah, a bit, you
Yeah.
know?
So going back to something you said earlier, which I thought was really interesting, is that boundary pushing is kind of normalized in kink spaces. And boundary pushing is also normalized I grew up evangelical in Southern Baptist churches in Alabama. And boundary pushing was also normalized in the context that I grew up in, where I was taught that men can't really control themselves, and that it was up to women to help. It was women's sacred responsibility to help control what men thought and felt by our clothing choices and our behavior. So if we were acting flirtatious or available, or we were simply alone with a man, or we were dressing in a certain way, then we should expect men to assault us essentially, and it would be our fault. And so a natural consequence of this is that men, when they would violate women and young girls, they would also sex is shameful, and so they would feel ashamed and they would feel like it was their fault, and they would not report it because then that would be admitting that they had messed up. Um, and I think that it's interesting how these things have the same kind of results, but coming from different justifications and in different contexts.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, I've been doing a lot of research into cults and alternative spiritualities. And it's been very interesting to me how often shame is used as a lever to keep people from reporting things that made them feel violated, and how coercion is often seen as totally fine actually. Or like I was just listening to a podcast about Revelations by Jennings Brown about Fellowship of Friends up in Northern California. California is rife with cults. Like, I swear every cult like hangs out in California at some point in their career. It's like a breeding ground. Um,
I mean,
and
it's the birthplace of evangelical Christianity, so
yeah, I mean, and there's a lot, it's a lot of that same, like, well, this is the leader, you can't question the leader. The leader is, the leader says that God speaks to them, and to question the leader is to go against God. Like, how convenient, you know? Um, and like, I think it's really interesting because, like, in the Bay Area, you see a lot of scorn sometimes for that kind of groupthink. And yet, you know, the same people who are like, oh, evangelical Christians, God, how do they believe this stuff? Will then go and join One Taste or, you know, be involved in one of a myriad of, you know, sex party communities that have the same kind of attitude and like a lack of accountability, a lack of any kind of checks and balances. So many of these parties don't talk to each other at all. So there's no ability to like check in and see if this person behaves poorly over here. Like it's just, it's so strange. Like even in a culture like San Francisco, where everybody is supposedly very sex positive and very communicative and hippie and like willing to be vulnerable, yet here they are like just, I don't know, just like not talking about these fundamental things and like not being willing to be vulnerable when it comes to something like, hey, I might have caused harm. They instead double down and shun the person who is seen as causing trouble.
yeah, absolutely. And I think I never, everything was so comparatively explicit in the way I grew up in terms of these men are in charge and men should be in charge and sex is shameful and you deserve it if you get raped. That, and I'm just kind of like probably autistic. And so I just tend to take people at their word generally. So when I got into these sex positive spaces, they said women are, you know, if anything, in charge, or we're gender egalitarian and consent is everything. And I just really took them at their word. And to be fair, I had a very like I've been groped and assaulted at, you know, bars and clubs, and I never had any problems in these spaces. And people were, you know, asked me before they touched me in any way, shape, or form. And it was a very safe, wonderful experience. And you know, to me, people walked the talk. And so I
Mm-hmm.
thought it was the talk was being walked generally speaking. And it was so horrifying to read these stories and realize, you know, I knew in the real world, you know, it really changed my world when I read that women who have disabilities are more likely to be raped.
Mm-hmm.
And I read these stories of these women, and they were generally speaking very young, in their early 20s, usually. They usually had other marks against them in terms of power. They didn't have a steady job, they didn't have community outside of this community. They were women of color, they had substance use problems, things that made it to where if they suffered consequences from coming forward, that could be very dire for them. They could lose their whole community, they could lose their housing, they could lose, you know, real stuff that's important to them. Whereas I was in a position where if I lost my community, I still had a job, I had a place to live, I had other community, I had a family who would take me in, like I had all these. And so I realized it was like, oh no, we had rapists, they were just choosing easier targets. Like that's why I was
Mm-hmm.
safe. And it was so disheartening. And so I think, you know, at the end of the day, you can have all of the good education and all the good talk, but if you have power and you don't have actual accountability, you're going to have abuse, which
Yeah,
was
I
so
mean, I think
disheartening.
some of the little bits that made me notice that, for example, was the way that there were play parties that or spaces where men would have to pay and women would get a discounted rate or be free. Um, and that seems like a benefit for women, right? But in reality, that ends up meaning that the men feel proportionally more entitled to the women who are there. So that would happen. Or I began to notice, like, oh, who's being featured on flyers? Oh, it's all 18-year-old, scantily clad, white, submissive women. Well, that's creating a vibe. If that's the art that you're seeing and those are the performers that are getting booked, then that begins to create a centering of who is valued in this community. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that then feeds into attitudes of wanting to please your partner or wanting to seem cool or wanting to seem tough that leads you to take more than you can handle. Um, and then there's that. I mean, I remember I got into a big argument with Janet Hardy, who wrote the topping and the bottoming book, and the ethical slut, like someone who I was shocked I was having these arguments with. And she said, well, if a submissive doesn't safe word, then that's on them. And I was like, what? Like, that's wild. How could you possibly believe that as somebody who helped create the sex positive culture? But it's because of that lack of understanding of power differentials. And I think it's a self-protective thing, because as long as you can say, well, they didn't say anything, so it's fine, then you didn't do anything wrong. And I think it's a lot messier than that.
I think it's that. I think it's definitely that. I think it's people want things to be black and white because ambiguity is scary, and the higher the stakes of the question, the more scary the ambiguity is. And I think the other thing, this is something I read a while ago about, why do so many people, including women and including survivors of sexual assault, blame the victim? And what the writer said was that the if you truly believe it could happen to you at any time for any reason, you can't get out of bed in the morning and function. Like, it's too
Yeah.
frightening. The reality of our vulnerability is too frightening. And so we believe that victims are at fault because it helps us feel safer. And
Yeah.
recognizing my own privilege in my safety is terrifying because it forces me to reckon with the reality that there are, like, I could become disabled tomorrow, right? I could lose all of my material possessions tomorrow and be as vulnerable or more than these other women. And that wouldn't be my fault, and it wouldn't be my fault. There are things I can do to try to keep myself safe, but we're all kind of at the mercy of forces beyond our control, and that's terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, I think what actually really what part of why I was very excited to talk to you about this, that's also true with evangelical Christianity, because there's very much that push of if you just pray hard enough, if you just keep the Lord in your heart in just the right ways, then bad things won't happen to you. You will be safe when the rapture happens. I've been talking to a teen that I've been mentoring who is absolutely terrified of the coming eclipse because he is completely convinced that he's going to go to hell if he doesn't cross his T's and dot his I's. Um, it's this sort of looming terror that his community uses to control him, um, with this understanding that if anything bad happens to you, it's because you didn't do something correctly. And I keep trying to explain to him that's because that weirdly that feels safer. It feels safer to think that there's something you could do. And it is a form of obsessive compulsive disorder. It's that belief, if I just flick this light switch enough times, I'm going to be okay. And that's, I've part of the research I've been doing has been into religious PTSD, and it does manifest a lot like OCD. I think that that is very similar to what we're seeing in the kink community and the poly community. So
For
I think
sure.
it's like
Okay,
it's interesting because it's not inherent to those communities, but it's maybe a little bit more visible there in some ways.
I mean, one thing that I'll give evangelical Christians and the kink community and the sex positive community is, they are talking about this stuff. So that's good. But anyway, we're about to get kicked off. I have us scheduled for a 15-minute break, and then we'll hop
Okay,
back on and continue the conversation if that works, still works for you.
excellent. Yes, sounds good. See you
Thank you.
in
All
15
right.
minutes.
See you in
Bye.
15. Bye. Welcome back. Thank you so much again. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is some of the more left approaches to consent. And so, the thing that I saw in my experience with sex positive feminist spaces was like an accountability process or an accountability pod. Can you kind of go over like
hmm
what that is?
Well, so in theory, the idea is that an accountability process is a set of steps that is communicated to a person who has done harm. There's usually a couple of people who are sort of mentors or guides in that process. It might also include an accountability pod, which would be a group of people who help that one person understand what they did wrong, or like how they broke the trust of the community, what they should have been doing, and how they're going to do better next time. Sometimes that accountability pod will act as sort of a mediator between the person who caused the harm and the victims of their harm. Um, though not always. There's a lot of complicated issues with this approach, in that we all kind of understand that it's not the victim's responsibility to help rehabilitate an abuser. But if the people who are harmed aren't a part of the process at all, then it's hard to say whether or not the person who is going through the accountability process, if they are doing the things that would help those survivors feel seen and like listened to. So there's a like, people don't want to force the issue by having a victim have to be a part of that process, but they do kind of, it lacks something if they're not involved, I think. And so that creates a sort of weird dichotomy of like, well, we can't make them do it, and also we're guessing at what would be better for the community.
Yeah. And I think an accountability process is better than, so it's kind of it's an alternative approach where there are several approaches. The default, of course, is to do nothing. The other alternative would be to like get the police involved.
hmm
There are lots of problems with getting the police involved. For one, the only thing the police can really do is prosecute that person and send them to jail and give them a
Which is,
criminal record, which is
even
criminogenic.
even if you have like a lot of proof, is
Right,
very difficult to do.
right.
Um, and yeah, is not super effective at helping prevent future harm. I mean, it's a punishment, certainly. Um, but yeah, oftentimes people will go to jail or to prison and end up engaging in more problematic behaviors, or like be exposed to more problematic mindsets. So it might not even resolve the issue in the first place. It might cause them to double down. And even if that worked the way it's supposed to, then this person leaves and often has difficulty getting jobs or housing. Um, so yeah, it sort of creates a system where there's not really long-term benefit for society.
Right, right. It's expensive for society and often creates more crime on net. So the other way you could do it is just to, you know, anytime anyone brings an accusation against someone, you just yeet them from the community. No process, no question. That's obviously problematic because then you just have unreformed rapists on the loose, potentially to join another community and cause problems, or you have issues where you're not dealing with a rapist. And so then you've yeeted somebody from their community who maybe didn't do anything wrong, or
Hmm.
maybe did to do something wrong, but could be rehabilitated or, educated. Um, so I think an accountability process is probably the best solution we have in terms of how communities can protect the people who are in these communities and the people who are not in these communities. But
Hmm.
like you said, there are lots of problems. One of the biggest problems is, again, going back to power. If someone with a lot of power brings an accusation against someone who has less power, or not even a lot, but if the power differential is the accuser has more power than the accused, often an accountability process can work pretty well if it's handled correctly in terms of figuring out what happened and taking appropriate action. Appropriate action would be educating the person, determining that it was a misunderstanding. Um, if it was an actual violation, teaching the person how to make amends and how to not have engage in that problematic behavior in the future. I also find that what will often happen with an accountability process is the offender will not participate. And if a community makes participation and graduation, quote unquote, a requisite for participating in the community, well, that will get rid of that person from that community, but then they're free to go and join another community, and the process happens again. And then the other issue is if you're a person who has less power than the accused person, um, an accountability process doesn't always happen.
Yeah.
Sometimes,
Well, and I mean, and it's only as good as its pod. And also I think there's the additional problem that most of the time, the people who end up doing the most thinking about these processes and solving these issues end up being femmes.
yeah,
They disproportionately end up being the ones who have to figure these things out, and they're disproportionately the victims of these things
right.
also. So that is an issue. On a sort of more general community scale, you also need the buy-in of both the perpetrator and the victim, right? Like, I mean, you need the perpetrator to feel like they are invested enough in this community that they care to learn and grow and evolve, and that's something they're committed to. But you also need the people who are harmed to be committed to restorative justice as opposed to punishment. And I love my fellow leftists, but I have definitely seen a lot of rapid response to accusations where there's a lot of clout, and unfortunately even there's some economic status to be gained from being known as someone who calls people out. Um, Oftentimes there isn't a direct connection. The people who are loudest about calling someone out are often not the victims, but somebody who follows one of the victims maybe, or a friend of a friend of a friend. So they're not getting the exact information of what happened. They're getting whatever's been told through the grapevine, which is often becomes more generalized. Um, it is, of course, very difficult to talk about these things publicly, especially in any great detail, because you can get sued for doing so. Um, so what ends up happening is someone, let's say, goes to a play party, and someone at that play party makes them feel uncomfortable. Maybe they um, slap their ass, something that is not okay, but not like the worst possible thing. That then gets translated to a boundary crossing, which then gets translated to a sexual assault, which is technically true, legally true. Um, and then people assume that that means rape. And so now this person who slapped somebody's ass is now a rapist. And there's no way to ask questions without it sounding like you don't trust the victims, when the people who are telling you that this person's a rapist aren't the victims. So that's spiraled way out of control. And I think that that's part of the problem with a lot of the accountability processes, is that there's not really a standard, and there's not really a way, like, we haven't mastered a way to have critical thinking in a compassionate way, I guess, where it's like, I think it's important to say, okay, but what exactly happened? Not because I don't believe you, but because my response is going to vary wildly depending on what happened. I was just listening to a podcast where this woman was talking about her experiences growing up as an evangelical Christian. And she said, one of the things I find really difficult is when we use the word violence to mean everything from someone told a joke that I'm uncomfortable with to an assassination. That's a huge spectrum. And I feel like that kind of happens with sexual assault and with boundary violations. Um, I think that part of the reason why that happens is because, in theory, we take rape more seriously than we take someone slapping somebody's ass. I would like to see us take both of those things seriously, um, so that you don't have to constantly be like increasing the stakes in order to make it count. I think that would also make it less scary for people to be told that they did something that hurt somebody else. Um, but then I am also somebody who, my approach has been, make my community small, make it people that I do have an investment in and who have an investment in me, people who I trust to tell me off when I fuck up. I think that's really, really important for me as somebody who talks about consent a lot, but also for me as just a person who wants to continue to grow. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. I think you bring up a really good point about, so the phrase that was used in the first like organization I was really a part of in the Bay Area sex positive community, they would talk about consent violations.
Mhm.
And that was an umbrella term for anything from a unsolicited ass slap to a violent anal rape, the consent violation,
Mhm.
which is true. It's an accurate term. It's true. Like, you violated someone's consent. Um, but it's so unspecific, right? And so when you say this person is accused of a consent violation, you have no, is this person a danger or not? Like,
Yeah.
obviously they're not, that's not great, whatever it is, if it happened, but there's a big difference in terms of my safety, depending on what we're talking about. And I think that's part of what, like you said, like, people aren't necessarily jumping at the bit to, recount in detail their experiences with consent violations. So it's often a friend of a friend telephone to figure out who did what, supposedly. Again, there's rarely any proof. Um, but this person who kind of prompted this conversation for me had admitted to consent violations. The consent
Mhm.
violations they'd admitted to were not always properly disclosing their STI status before unprotected sex. Not
Mhm.
an okay thing to do, not an acceptable thing to do. Also, somewhat understandable in terms of substance use and heat of the moment and forgetting. And it's like, now if you do this multiple times, it's less understandable, but
And are we talking about herpes or are we talking about
it was
hepatitis?
herpes. Right, right,
Like,
right, right.
like there's a
Truly,
huge realm there too.
truly. And
And my question would be like, in order, like part of what I would see as a sort of a community leader of no longer, I try to avoid being a community leader. If anything, I just live as a hermit. Um, but I would say, okay, well, how can we as a community encourage people to disclose STI status? Because I see that as potentially an individual problem, but also potentially a community problem. Like
and
I've
yeah,
definitely been in a lot of communities where people don't talk about herpes or HPV, sometimes because they don't know, which is still, it's still hard to get proper testing for both of these things, which is frustrating, especially in the United States. Um, and sometimes because they're afraid of stigma, which is real, and there's really no reason for people to be stigmatizing it within sex positive communities, and yet it still happens. So I think that's where I think a lot of these things break down. It's easy to say, well, this person needs to do these different behaviors, but then there's less comfort, I think, in saying, okay, well, how can we as a community, like, can we use this as information? Not that we're at fault here, but is this good information as something we should maybe work on? Like, is this an area that we could spend a little more time on? Like I think again, so much of these conversations go back to who's at fault. And we're a very, like um litigious society in a lot of ways. So we like to find fault. We like to blame someone. But instead of blame, like, what if we saw it as, like, this is why I like to talk about what if we could create a consent culture instead of trying to avoid a rape culture or an entitlement culture? A consent culture would say, okay, here are some things that this individual person needs to work on, but hey, maybe this is a good checkpoint for us to look around and say, are we doing everything we could be doing to make sure that people feel really informed about herpes and HPV? Do we encourage safer sex? Like, what does that look like for us?
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's super important. And I think what I realized speaking to some of the people who ran that organization was they had a process where they um, said, if you experience anything that you don't like, reach out to, us, the leadership team. This is how after the event, and we'll take action. And a lot of it was miscommunication, misunderstanding, and could be dealt with and prevented with education and accountability processes. So I think all that's really important. This guy in particular, who the consent violations I knew about were around STI disclosure. I mean, he ran groups where part of the consent talk was about disclosing your status.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no lack of
This,
education.
this is totally that same fucking thing that you see with pastors, right? Like,
Right.
do what I say, not what I do, right? Like, if
Exactly.
you, I mean, honestly, this is what you also see with some of the leftist call out squad is like, if I'm super loud about these behaviors that I think are unacceptable, I can kind of cover up anything that I've been doing wrong. And that's why I'm kind of trying to, like, it's hard because like there are people who are acting in bad faith, and there are people like sometimes punishment is the only thing that works. And that sucks, but like, I got to be realistic. Sometimes that is the only thing you could do. You can't rehabilitate everyone. And as a femme, I'm fucking exhausted trying to rehabilitate people. So like, I have to figure out like, well, so what am I willing to do here? Um, but like, yeah, it's just, I feel like when we create all of these systems of blame, we aren't encouraging people to have humility about their own fuck ups. And like, I guess that's a lot of my educational stuff is around the only person you can control is you. So I can't make the rest of my community behave in any way. All I can do is say, this is how I'm going to behave. I'm going to model the thing that I want to see and hope that if enough people witness that and say, oh, that seems to be going okay for her, maybe I can do that safely. Maybe that can create change. Because I just don't think I don't think there's a system I could put in place that's going to be perfect. I think
No,
it's super situational.
I think it's super situational. And I also think, you know, I am part of an organization, and part of my like role as part of a smaller subset of that organization is to help moderate an online community. And when I think about consent culture in terms of rape and sexual assault, when I think about people opening up their relationships, when I think about moderating communities, I get really frustrated with the idea of rules, because at the end of the day, um, people who like really want to not be shitbags usually don't need the rules, and the people who really want to
Mm-hmm.
be shitbags are just going to use the rules to their
They'll
advantage.
find a way around them. Yeah.
So, but you can't not have them,
Right.
often. So,
That's
but
why I found it helpful to use guidelines instead and like have those guidelines be a living document that the leadership and the community made together. And so like every 3 months, every 6 months, we would sit down as a community and say, is there anything here that's not working? Is there a way we should fine tune this language? What would you like to see happen? And I think that that created more investment. Like I used to run a sex party, Kinky Salon London, and a huge part of what I wanted to do when I started it, I had a board. We had 10 people who were the leadership that spanned a huge variety of sexual orientations, of ethnicity, of gender. Like, and part of the reason why I wanted to do that is because I wanted to make sure that there was like two people who could call anybody else out. And I also, funnily enough, I had a rule of like no couples. Like you could, like if you were on the board, you could not sleep with other people on the board. And that was because I had gone to so many sex parties where the people who are the leaders who got to decide who came to the party and who didn't were a couple. And that created a power dynamic where you couldn't really call them out because the other person was their partner. So I was like, nope, we're not going to have any of that. Like, I'm going to be really strict around this. I think it worked better. I don't think it was perfect. And we definitely had our own issues. Like one of our board ended up calling the rest of us out when we came up with a theme for a party. We themed it Jungle Bonk, thinking, haha, fun, jungle themed, Disney, whatever. And the person who spoke to us about it was like, hi, I am South Asian. This is super offensive. And we were like, oh, fuck. Like, we had not thought about that at all. Um, what I think was great was that because we had this board and because we had an investment in each other, our immediate response was, hell yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, we have some of the decor already. Could we theme it ecosexual? Would that allow us to use the decor we have, but fix this problem? And then I think we ended up like going to a like academic discussion or something about this situation to educate ourselves further on like the harm that had been caused and like how we needed to think about it in the future so it didn't happen again. And we were able to leave that as friends. And it made me think like this is what's missing. I have found that most of the time when I lean into somebody calling me out and saying, "Hey, you hurt me in this way," when I say, "Oh no, how can I help you feel safe right now? Like, what can I do?" Um, Most of the time people are like, "Oh, okay, cool. Like, let me help you help me. I don't like feeling bad." And since your response wasn't defensive and violent, I feel really comfortable engaging you in good faith. I just don't think that happens very often. I think there's this fear that if you bare your belly in that situation, people are going to tear into you. And I'll be honest, it'll happen. It'll happen once or twice. But the vast majority of times, people are going to feel relief. Like when people call you out, even if they're doing it in a mean sounding way, that's a symbol of trust. If they didn't trust you to do something about it, they wouldn't bother calling you out. They would just distance themselves from you entirely. The fact that people are willing to say something to you about your behavior, to me, is an indication that they trust me to do the right thing. And even when they're like, "Kitty's a jerk, and here's some behavior she did where she really fucked up," that's still on some level an indication of trust that I'm going to read that and go, "Yeah, that is kind of shitty of me. I'm going to fix that." So otherwise, why would they bother?
I think that's true of most people, and I think that most people are, pro-social. I think where we have issues is that we create systems for most people, and that's good, but they have to somehow be resilient against the people who are exceptional and
Yeah, the bad actors.
who, maybe not even are bad people always, maybe, but they don't, they're trying to get clout, or they're trying to sow discord when they call you out, or they're trying to just feel better for 5 seconds by making somebody feel worse. Those people exist. And we have to be resilient to their behavior as well.
See, that's what I found so interesting. And I mean, I just be my own luck in these situations, but I found that my willingness to let people do that really takes the teeth out of people who are trying to do it just to hurt me. Because they want me to be like, "I didn't mean that. How could you think that?" They want me to react in that way, in this defensive way, because then that shows some sort of discord. That creates that discord. If I say, "Oh no, oh wow, I fucked up. Like, tell me more about that. Let me take some time to like really reflect on this and like learn more about this situation so I don't do that again." Then they're like, "Oh, okay." Like, I mean, what do you do with that? Like, yeah, that'll show you, like it's not a very effective bullying tactic.
That's such a good point. That makes perfect sense. Because if you
I
responded like in a shitty way, it proves them right to an
Yeah,
extent.
absolutely. Yeah.
At
Even
least,
if you don't think that their accusations are correct, being willing to take time to think about it and to say, "I haven't entertained that, but I will. Let me reflect. Here are some things I'm going to do to make sure that doesn't happen again." Um, that that's what I want to see from people, like, and I mean, again, like, I think you can have bad actors who say the right things and then proceed to continue to do that behavior. But at that point, they have labeled how they know they should be acting. And when they repeat the shitty behavior, you could say, "Okay, this is now a pattern. Clearly, you're just being manipulative." Like, you now have another thing to add of like, you're saying one thing and doing something else. You clearly know what you're doing wrong. So now I don't think this is in good faith anymore. So what are you going to do about that? it like allows you to, I don't know, like expose, it puts sunlight on the people who are acting in bad faith a little bit more easily. Now, I'm open to the fact that there's probably people that you could do all of this and they'd still be good at being sneaky in these very specific ways. But a lot of times, people who are being abusive, they're trying to isolate the victims, they're trying to silence the victims, they're trying to wiggle their way out of accountability. I think having these like honest, open dialogues makes those things really hard to do. Um, Not impossible. I'm sure it's possible. I believe that people have an amazing capacity to find out ways to fuck other people over. But I do think the more we can create a smaller but, I don't know, more aware community that really cares about fixing these things, it's so much harder to get away with that shit.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to say, like, I really appreciate you. I don't know if you like the term calling in, but that's how I feel like you did it, about, something I'd posted about fatness. And I think it's really tough because like you get more out of being an asshole than being a good person. It's easier to be an asshole. You get clout from it. You get to feel like, you get to be a bully. Whereas what you did, it took more energy and you got less reward.
Yeah.
That's hard, you
But
know?
you know what? I get to feel smug about it. So I have that. No, I mean, you're not wrong. Like it is harder in a lot of ways. It is much easier to phrase things in black and white ways, to be angry at people. Um, and I just have actively chosen not to do that. Like, when I see somebody trying to goad me, I'm just like, no, thank you. Like I'd rather not. Um, and I don't know. It's like I found aggressive good faith has actually saved me a lot of time and trouble. Um, Learning to in general, I'll call people in privately as much as possible now because I've learned that when you say it in public, you're not really saying it for that person. You're saying it for other people reading the conversation, which is sometimes helpful. If you don't think you're going to change that individual's mind, maybe that's the thing to do, right? Is to say, this person does not speak for me. But if I do think that this person may have said something because they hadn't thought about it in this other way, or they don't have as much information on this specific thing, yeah, of course I'm going to say, like, hey, are you aware of this? Like, maybe this is a context you don't have. I don't have any idea what it's like to live as a Black person in the United States. So I'm going to defer to my Black friends to tell me what that's like. I have no way of knowing, no matter how much I read or how much I educate myself. There's always going to be places I stumble. I just choose to look at those as opportunities for growth rather than things to be ashamed of. I joke with my friends all the time. I just wasn't raised with shame, so I don't know what that's like. And I do think that influences a lot of my aggressive good faith behavior because I find that rather than shaming people into behaving better, I'm just sort of like, you couldn't possibly have meant that, right? And in general, people go, yeah, I don't think that. Like even that evangelical teen that I mentor, like he'll say something about tattoos being sinful or something. I'll be like, oh, that's really interesting. That hasn't been my experience. And here are some ways that tattoos are meaningful for me. But you know what? You're allowed to think whatever you want. Like you get to have autonomy about that. And he said something like, wow, you're just, I don't know why I'm so nervous saying things that disagree with you because you're always so nice about it. And I'm like, it's not about, for me, it's not about being nice. It's about being kind. And it's about recognizing that my viewpoint isn't universal. Um, if I thought that if I thought he wasn't acting in good faith, if I thought that he was like trying to get me into an argument about queer rights or something so he could post it on Truth Social and be like, look at this queer 40-year-old grooming teens, I would interact with him very differently. But he's proven to me over and over again that my aggressive good faith has been valid and has been worthwhile. And because of that, we're having really great conversations about topics that are usually pretty fraught. I want to live in that world. So I'm going to keep making the world around me that world. And then more and more people want to be in that world instead.
And I
But
think
yeah, there's no money to be made in it. Yeah, no, I will never make money off of it. If I went out into the world and was like, I am a consent expert, do the things I tell you to do, God, I would have so much more money. My books would be like New York Times bestsellers. I don't do that because it's not in line with my ethics. And it does cost me, you know? That's just the trade you got to make.
absolutely, unfortunately. And I think if I were like, and I have a lot of feelings about like advice and self-help versus like, you know, policies and structures, but since we don't have a
Yeah,
policy solution and since we don't even have a structural solution, we kind of got to default to advice and self-help. And that's, I think, one thing that I've learned over the years is that, yeah, your world is very much what you make it, and you get more of what you put out and expect. And so for me, for example, I am very, um, I don't tend to allow people to be close to me who are not, don't say what they mean and mean what they say.
mm-hmm.
Because when I have people around me like that, I get cynical about everyone. Like I start to expect people to not mean what they say and say what they mean, which
Yeah,
then more people conform to my expectations and my world just gets very scary and yucky.
yeah,
And you know, if anything, I think people are too lonely now. But in part, I think it's because we're not intentional and careful enough about who we let in, and who we take the effort to keep around. When you find those people who, you know, respond well to being called in, you know, to
yeah,
hold them close. I don't
yeah.
know.
I mean, I think I try to be optimistic about that. The more I say I don't know, and isn't that cool? What a great thing to be able to acknowledge what I don't know and that I can continue to learn and take on information that will help me be a better member of my society in ways that are meaningful to me. I choose to be optimistic with that. Um, I wasn't always. I used to be a lot more pessimistic, and it didn't serve me. So,
I love
I
that.
choose to have like a clear-eyed optimism. But also, yeah, I'm also a realist, and you can't just good thoughts and feelings your way through someone who is determined to hurt you. Sometimes you have to punch someone in the face, like
Yeah. Or, you know, somehow physically separate yourself from them.
yeah.
So in the minute and a half we have left, I just want to take another opportunity to promote your books, Ask Building Consent Culture, Ask Yourself, the Consent Culture Workbook, and Say More, Consent Conversations for Teens. Where else can people follow you, find you, support you?
I'm officially Kitty Stryker on Facebook. That's where I post a lot of my writings and stuff. I have a Patreon, patreon.com/Kitty Stryker. That's where I do little uh previews for books that I'm working on. I'm currently working on a book called Love Rebels: Radical Relationships for Radical Activists, which is going to talk about how to be an activist and not lose your mind. So yeah, I have to learn how to do that first, but that's my next plan.
I love it. I can't wait to read that. That sounds very applicable to my interests. And thank you so much for coming on and being so generous with your time and
Yeah, thanks for having
expertise
me. It's always a good
or
time.
experience. Awesome. All right. I'll see you soon.
Bye. See you soon.